I'm so glad to introduce Dr. Danielle L. Watt, PhD, who is the new Associate Director of the Department of Health Career Opportunities at the University of Connecticut Health Center, School of Medicine, and School of Dental Medicine. At UCHC, she focuses on the recruitment and retention of medical and dental students, co-directs summer undergraduate research, medical and dental prep programs, and oversees pipeline programs that encourage middle and high school students to pursue careers in medicine and biomedical research. She received her BA in chemistry from Albany State University at HBCU and a PhD in biological organic chemistry from the University of Connecticut, Storrs, where she studied how chemicals in the environment may damage DNA, causing mutations that could ultimately lead to lung cancer. After completing a postdoc in DNA replication and repair at the NIH, she spent 2 years conducting DNA replication research at Umeå University, Sweden. In 2015, she transitioned to higher education administration as the Director of Education, Outreach, and Diversity in the NSF Center for Chemistry at the Space-Time Limit at the University of California, Irvine. At CASTL Center, she focused her efforts on the professional development of early career scientists, increased underrepresented minorities in STEM through managing undergraduate research training programs, and developing K-12 outreach programs. Just before the pandemic, she bid farewell to California to join the University of Minnesota Medical School as the Director of the Office of Biomedical Graduate Research, Education, and Training, where she focused on graduate student recruitment and retention, co-directed a summer undergraduate research program, and consulted with faculty, trainees, and senior leadership on the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Throughout her career, Dr. Watt has worked with university deans, faculty, and staff to develop best practices in the recruitment and the retention of underrepresented groups for faculty positions, graduate education, research training programs, and engagement in informal outreach programs. Her commitment to exposing youth to science spans over 20 years and has been recognized by local and national organizations, where she received the NOB CCHE, Dr. Henry McVeigh Outstanding Educator Award, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Distinguished Service Award, and the NIH Merit Award. We are so glad to have Dr. Watt in our presence to teach this workshop again. And without further ado, I will hand it over to her to share.
Thank you, Paige. And I would also like to thank the organizers at Black in Neuroscience for the invitation. Let me know if you all can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me back. I'm excited to be able to share some of my insights and experiences with you all in regards to interviewing for either graduate school or for postdocs or even jobs post training. And I'm going to make sure I have enough time at the end of my talk morning or afternoon, or evening, depending on which time zone you're in, so we can get to as many questions as possible. But feel free to follow up with me. I will have my contact information on the last slide if there's certain questions that we don't get an opportunity to get to, or if something comes up later on that you would like to for me to address. And so hopefully from the session today, you'll get an opportunity to identify several strategies to effectively communicate your experience and your abilities, the strengths that you have that will contribute to the graduate program or enhance the organization or institution in which you're going to be working as a postdoc or a professional, and really develop those skills to make a positive first impression, but a lasting impression in those interviews, because you ultimately want that organization or institution to say, we want that person. And so it's essential to get a good night's sleep when you're preparing for an interview. And many times I know in these types of workshops, people jump right into how you can prepare for an interview, but it's essential that night before for you to be able to get the sleep that you need to get rid of any toxins in your body, especially in that brain. You need about at least 7 hours of sleep a night. Make sure you also dress for success. And so, when you dress and feel good, you walk into any interview feeling more confident. So, when you feel good, or you look good, or you look good, you just got your hair done, or you have on this new outfit that you've been dying to rock, that you say, oh, you have a little more swag. You're just like, yes, I'm here. So it helps to establish and build upon your confidence, and shows that you're ready and prepared for the position, because that our physical appearance does contribute to that first impression. And so the different areas I'm going to talk about in the session today is, how do you prepare for an in-person interview or a virtual interview? How to different strategies to do your research about the institution or organization. If you have a research talk, sometimes especially if you're applying for a postdoc or a job, you might have to give a chalk talk. So I'll briefly cover some of those areas, but also preparing your self-introduction. That's a question that sometimes people usually get their first question in an interview. And sometimes we stumble on that introducing ourselves, because you assume that they remember certain aspects about your application because they reviewed it. But it's a great opportunity for you to refresh the memories of those that you're interviewing with, that may have been on the initial admissions committee or selection committee, and really highlight those key skills and experiences that you have to help you be successful in whatever role that you're applying to. How to identify those skills and experiences and really have those stand out and shine during an interview. Make sure you have a series of practice questions, so you're going in prepared, and hopefully you won't be hearing some of those common questions for the first time. How to develop questions that you want to ask. You should always go into an interview prepared with 3 to 5 questions to show that, one, you're engaged, you are well informed about that institution, that graduate program or organization, and that you following up with the members of the admissions or selection committee, so you know what the next steps are. Being a person of color, I identify as a Black woman, and I have natural hair. And so sometimes I have to worry about how I present myself in those interviews. Am I going to wear my hair out in its natural state? Am I going to have it more tamed? So sometimes, we have to be, well, at least for me, cognizant of how I am stepping in or presenting myself in that space. I am a person who likes color, as you see with my bright red jacket. So I want to show up and be my authentic self. There are certain stereotypes that are associated being a Black person or a Black woman in STEM. We experience microaggressions based off various identities that are visible and invisible. And so those are certain things that we have to take into account when we step into a space for an interview, or even preparing for a space, and as we go with an interview. Also, especially dealing with our imposter fears, or what is commonly called imposter syndrome. And so I want us to be able to, one, acknowledge that these things happen to us. It's something we have to think about and be mindful of when we enter into these spaces, but how do we bring our whole self? Recognizing that these can hinder us from shining within those interviews. And so maybe I'm a person who's like to speak with my hands. So as you see, my hands are in the screen, so you may see that happen. So sometimes I'll have to be mindful of not talking as much with my hands or my facial expressions when I'm engaging with someone, especially if I don't know them. That could be misinterpreted as an unintentional, or it could be interpreted as a negative or an intentional negative. And so these are things in practicing your responses to certain questions, be helpful, practicing with other people so they can give you valuable feedback. And then also thinking about who you're going to be interviewing with. What are some of the common practices within that space as you engage with different people? Also being mindful of our negative self-talk as we engage with microaggressions, stereotypes, our imposter fears, and what are some ways that we can calm or eliminate that negative self-talk? Is it maybe meditating or have practicing breathing exercises before we enter into that space? And so determine what's going to work best for you to be able to get in a positive mind frame for you to engage and put your best foot forward. So as you're preparing for your interview, you want to determine if it's going to be virtual or in person. If it's a virtual interview, you want to determine what's the platform you're going to be using. Is it accessible for your needs or requirements? Are you going to need maybe access to a internet access? Are you in a space where you may not have a good connection? So you might have to think about the old plugging into the Ethernet cable to help increase and stabilize your internet connection versus a wireless connection. Being in a place where you have low background noise and less distractions behind you, especially sometimes if you're sitting next to a window, you might pay attention to people who are passing by the window or the amount of noise or other people, if you're sitting in front of a window, that can be distracting to those who are interviewing you because that will be your background space. So be mindful of the backgrounds that you select. You can choose a space in like where I am, where the background is pretty plain, but you get a chance to focus on me and what I'm saying, hopefully, during that interview. Or I see, you can have a virtual background as well. Many people have something similar to like maybe a library or office space in a virtual background, or maybe a solid or their school, a solid background or their school logo. You can do that as well, but something that's not going to distract the interviewers from really engaging with you. If you're in person, you want to determine what is the location of the meetings, who you're going to be meeting with. Are you going to have an escort in between the meetings to show you where on campus you're going to be going? Or are you going to have to navigate that space by yourself? If you have the opportunity to maybe go a few days beforehand to try to identify where are you going to have to park? Are you going to have to pay for parking? Is it free? If you're taking public transportation, how accessible is that to the location of your first meeting and your last meeting of the day? Will you need access to the building? Some institutions, as you know, has heightened security, especially since the pandemic. And you want to know who are you going to have a phone number to call someone if you need access to the building or even to that wing of the building or organization and institution. I worked at a government facility. So at NIH, we had guards at the front gate. So you had to take some time to get through the gate and get approved to be on that campus. So these are some things that you want to be mindful of and really consider if you're going to be in person. Again, knowing who you're going to be meeting with, what's most likely the topics of discussion, where you're meeting and when. And so the who you're meeting, I would say, will be one of the most important aspects of this determining the space, because you get an opportunity to do a little research on those people and understand, okay, well, what types of questions they're going to be asking me? Is this someone whose research I'm interested in? Is this someone who's a program director who provides resources or support for employees, postdocs, graduate students, and I can formulate some questions to ask them during my interview. Is it a graduate student? So I can ask them certain questions about their experience in the program, their engagement with faculty and staff and higher level leadership in the graduate program. Is it with other postdocs? Is there a postdoc association or postdoc rep that you can that you're going to be meeting with and can ask them certain types of questions? Researching the graduate program or organization or even institution, if you're applying for a postdoc, is really important. You want to enter into that interview being prepared. and knowledgeable about the organization, because that'll help you formulate questions and get clarifying points on the resources that are available. So you want to carefully reread the job announcement if you're applying for the postdoc or job, but also the program description if you're applying to a graduate school. And that might entail reviewing the mission and goals. So that mission statement of the organization or institution, all universities have them. What's the goals of that institution or organization if you're applying to industry? As you know, the past several years, many institutions or organizations have updated or developed for the very first time diversity, equity, and inclusion statements or DEI statements. I have this highlighted in red because that might be important to you as an underrepresented member, as a member of an underrepresented group, especially if you identify as African American. What is that organization or institution's commitment to people who look like me or have identities similar to what I have? Understanding the research that's conducted, how does it align with your interests? What are the products that might be produced from that company or organization that aligns with what you want to do in your career? Again, who are you going to be interviewing with? Is there people listed on the or absent from your interview list that you really want to connect with? That might be an opportunity for you to ask or request to meet with those people. Are there recent publications listed on the websites? Or if you do a PubMed search or Google Scholar search or whatever type of search to find some of the recent publications and understanding some of the projects, you can't always rely on some of the faculty members' websites. An example of that is when I was at UC Irvine, one of our faculty members' websites was outdated by maybe 25 years. And so all of the projects that were listed, because he didn't really have publications listed on his website, were 25 years ago. And so students will contact him and say, oh, I'm interested in this project. And he'll say, okay, clearly you didn't do your research. I know you're looking at this website, which is grossly outdated. But if you pulled some of our recent publications, then you can kind of get an idea of where our research focus has been over the past 20 years. And so you don't want to just rely on one resource when you're doing background information or researching an organization or a faculty member. Determine what stands out for you for that lab, that faculty member, that department or graduate program, that institution that you would like to do your postdoc at or join as a professional. Are there resources for you to be successful? What does that look like for you? The resources that we all need is going to be different depending on what our unique and individual needs are, even as a collective group of African American Blacks in STEM. Are you interested in growth opportunities? Are there any available? Are there training or internships available to you as a graduate student in addition to your training with your primary advisor or faculty advisor? Are there opportunities for you to serve in leadership roles as you're going through your graduate training? I love to include this slide because, as I mentioned, that I do a lot of my talking with my hands and my facial expressions. So Zoom has helped me to kind of rein in my facial expressions when I'm engaging with people. But the way we communicate is usually through the visual, so our body language. And that could be our posture, our movements. Sometimes I have colleagues that like to pace back and forth when they're talking, and sometimes that could be distracting for people because they're not paying attention to what you're saying. They're counting how many times you're moving back and forth across the room. It could be your actions. If I have my arms folded, I tend to do that when I'm cold, but some people could interpret that as me being standoffish. And so just being mindful of the common associations, whether it's positive or negative, when you're in a certain space. And so again, the folded arms could be that example. If you're using visual aids, so if you're giving that research talk or chalk talk, What visual representation do you have to convey your research interests? How are you putting together those slides? Are they conveying the key messages that you want to relay when you're giving that research talk? Is your talk easy to follow, easy to understand? Do people understand the significance of your work, what you did to address your research question, and then what your plans are to advance that research in the future? 38% of how we communicate is actually with our voice, and 7% are the words that we actually use. And so if you want to convey a key message to someone, usually it's how we, that's our nonverbal cues. But with our voice, I mean, I know I've done this a couple of times during my talk, and maybe you've caught it where I say or pause, or have those other filler words like, you know. And so if you do that too often during your talk, people would begin to transition from listening to what it is you're saying to actually counting how many times you used like, and And so getting that practice and getting comfortable with who you're going to be interviewing with will help you to eliminate or reduce the amount of the use of those fillers. You want to speak clearly and at a normal pace. I know when I get nervous, I have a tendency of speaking fast. And when I speak a lot faster than I normally do, I have a tendency to stutter. And so you want to determine what is your normal pace, because in certain cultures, normal pace might be faster than in other cultures. And so again, it'll be essential for you to determine who you're going to be meeting with to see, okay, well, if this normal pace is faster than my normal pace of speaking is faster than what's historically done in American culture. And enunciating your words and being mindful and conscious of the words that you're using will help you to slow down your pace and to help you to steady your breathing, which also helps you to relax and become more calm and not as nervous or anxious during an interview. So that self-introduction, as I mentioned during the start of my talk, that introducing ourselves, or that question, tell me about yourself, is one that sometimes we often overlook or may not be as prepared. Or you may say, okay, well, what is it that you want to know? Ask me a direct question. Tell me about yourself is so general. There's is a great way for you to give a summary overview of who you are, your experiences, and your interests. And so summarizing the previous experiences and how it prepared you for the specific role, postdoc position, graduate education, and any significant outcomes you've had that relates to what it is that you want to do. Connect the requirements of the position. So this is where revisiting that job announcement or the program requirements or program announcement for graduate programs. To your background, your interests, whether it's educational or career interests, your goals, and your experience and qualifications that will help you to be successful in that particular role. If you're applying to or have a graduate school interview, tell them who you are, what institution you may be at, the level you are. So they're assuming you're going to, you're a graduating senior. But what are those educational goals? So you're pursuing the PhD. Why? Is the PhD connected to what your ultimate career goals are? So I'm going to begin discussing two key strategies that I like to recommend to students. And the first is to rate your skills and experiences by reflecting on what your experiences are. So you can do that by maybe conducting an outline or just pausing in those moments to really think about, what have I done? And do I have this documented anywhere? Maybe start a Word document to begin to go back to college and determine what you did over the academic year, but also the summer. Articulate how those experiences have helped you develop certain competencies that, especially if they relate to the area or field that you're interested in pursuing. Translate the value of those competencies. Are there certain techniques or other experiences and training that's essential for that discipline or even that position or the lab that you're seeking to join? Evaluate your level of readiness in each of those competencies, because that might also indicate to you why you're interested in pursuing that particular position or graduate program, but it also can identify deficiencies or areas that you can grow and develop further. So it might open additional opportunities for you to be trained in those areas or determine, well, how key are these competencies to what it is I want to do in the future? The second is to develop a STAR story, and that's the situation, identifying situation, task, action, and results that really play on your strengths. And this is a really common strategy used for effective storytelling, where it helps you to be concise and direct in identifying your key skills, but also connecting it to positive outcomes. So for the situation, you want to provide in maybe one or two sentences the context or the background of the situation. And then you want to describe the challenges or problem you were tasked with. And then what were the actions that you chose to take to address that challenge or problem? And this gives the interviewer insight into your critical thinking and how you process or problem solve when faced with the challenge. And then how you choose to problem solve demonstrates the results section really demonstrates your ability to be successful in your unique approach to that problem. And so if you can say, okay, well, here's a strength of mine. Here's a situation that I was, in. I'll give you a couple of examples in the next slide. But then here's my approach. But here's how my approach has had success, where we've had these positive outcomes. This is how it benefited the lab or organization. And this is the impact that has had in us moving forward in this particular area. So a common example I like to give, I think, whether you're applying to graduate school or to a job or a postdoc, is we all work with other people in the lab. And so the situation here was that, okay, I was a student intern. This maybe is an undergraduate summer research researcher, or maybe as a graduate student, you were intern in an industry lab for maybe 2 months, excuse me, during your graduate training. And you worked with 5 other researchers and also 2 other trainees. And you were tasked with training the 2 new trainees that were joining the lab, where you had to revise and update a certain standard operating procedure for a commonly used technique in the lab. So the action you took was to create a resource manual, because there wasn't one that existed before, and you asked some of the other researchers in the lab to contribute to this resource manual, which resulted in you being able to simplify training of others, especially those 2 new trainees that joined the lab. But then it also gave the entire lab the opportunity to document all of the lab practices, improved record keeping. I don't know how many of you have worked in the lab and you inherit a project from someone and you go to look up what they did in the lab notebook. Either the chicken scratch is something you can't really read, or is incomplete, or it doesn't exist. But maybe you work in a lab that's international, very diverse, where people speak multiple languages. And maybe you're able to then translate that standard operating procedure for not only that one technique that's commonly used in the lab, but other techniques into other languages. And so that's a significant impact on the lab operating procedures and training of new members of the lab. And so this could be a significant result for this specific, lab example. Here is just a general list of some of the common questions that you may engage in, especially if you're applying to graduate school and you see the tell me about yourself and what your career goals are, the first two most commonly used questions. But if you're looking at applying to a postdoc, some of the questions you might get also might link more to your ultimate career goal, whether it's in academia, government, industry. And so you really want to reflect more on your research, what are your interests, what are the areas that you want to develop your research in, and how is that going to relate to what you're going to do in the next year or 2 years, or maybe even 3 years in a postdoc, depending on where you're going to be conducting your postdoc research. And so I'll leave this up for a little more, but you'll have access to the slides where one of the take-home activities for you to do to prepare for next week's workshop is to identify some questions you may struggle with answering and start to draft some responses. Reflect on what experiences and skills you have that you might want to highlight, either using that STAR story or maybe another technique to convey that in an interview. Practice with other people that you trust that give you positive, constructive feedback, and see how you can incorporate that into responding to these questions. So here's the take-home activity that I would like for you to write a summary. It could be maybe 4 to 5 sentences about tell me about yourself. Who are you? So an introduction to who you are when you first enter that interview room or space. And then identify again those questions you might have difficulty in answering, and then brainstorm and practice with other people. When you're preparing for an interview, it's really important for you to walk in and prepare to ask questions. But you want to ask questions that can't be answered online. I get questions from students during their interview, and they're asking me general program questions that are literally within the first paragraph on our website. And that shows either that maybe you weren't in tune, or maybe you're not as interested in our graduate program because you didn't take the time to really research who we were. Or maybe you got so nervous that you forgot. And so again, finding ways to calm yourself down as you're going through the interview process. So either deep breathing exercises, a brief meditation, a full body scan, or maybe just counting on your fingers and tracing the outline of your fingers will help, because that's recentering your mind on something else besides the interview, and it helps to calm your mind, which then helps to modify your breathing and to put you in a more relaxed space. The types of questions that you would like to ask are clarifying questions or informational types of questions where the answer is not readily accessible, either in previous documents you may have received to prepare for that interview or on the organization's website. You can also ask questions that really explore the issues that matter to you. As I mentioned before, as a Black woman, there are certain things I'm going to be looking for in a graduate program. Are there other people who look like me? When was the last time someone from, who was Black or African American graduated from that program? Where are they now? Are there student organizations that support that will support me or my tenure while in your program? Are there faculty and staff that support Black and other underrepresented groups in STEM? What's the culture, the climate in that graduate program? And so that might matter to some people, and some people, they could care less about that issue, even as a person of color. So determine what matters to you, and then know who is the appropriate person or people to ask. There are certain types of questions that might be more appropriate for graduate students, especially if you're talking about culture and climate, versus asking a staff member or a faculty member or a chair of a search or selection committee. So draft your questions, your list of questions, and then determine who should I identify to ask these questions of. And if you get a listing of who you're going to be meeting with for those interviews, identify those people and say, this is the question I want to ask so-and-so, or these are the questions I think I should ask this group of people that I know I'm meeting with. And so when you walk in and you say, well, do you have any questions for me? Yes, I have this question. I have a couple of questions. Or these are some things I would like to have clarified. The follow-up after you have completed your day or maybe consecutive days of interviewing, it's a good idea to follow up with everyone that you've met with, just to say it was a pleasure meeting with you. It can even be through email. It doesn't have to be like a snail mail note, depending on the type of interview you've had, especially if it's maybe a second or third interview, then you might want to follow up with a nice little note in addition to an email. But a follow-up in many cases is reasonable. Especially if you're applying for a job, it's good to have a follow-up. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from employers that, this person was a great candidate, but after the interview, we didn't hear anything from them. And the other person sent us this really nice email about meeting with us and engaging with us, and had some additional follow-up questions, and they showed more interest or more initiative to engage with us after the interview. And so guess what? The person who neglected to send a follow-up did not get the job. And so this is a good way for you to also confirm the timeline that you will have, or the organization has, to inform you of their decision, or what the next round might look like, or if they're going to be secondary or third look interviews. Again, this is a good way for you to also get additional questions that you maybe forgot to answer, or you went back and something else caught your eye about that graduate program. And so following up with those people you met with is a good idea. So hopefully from this talk, as I'm going to transition into taking questions, and I see there's some in the Q&A already. So if you do have additional questions, I'm on my last 2 slides. Please add them to the Q&A box, and we'll get to those during the talk. But hopefully today you were able to learn different strategies for whether your interview is in person or virtual. Be able to identify different ways to effectively communicate through your body language or other verbal cues, such as your language or word use, and your voice, your tone and pitch in which you speak. Doing your research about the institution, the organization, the lab, the faculty, the students, and their experience, how it connects to your research interests and your career goals. Preparing for your self-introduction to really initiate a great interview. Being able to recognize and identify those skills and experiences you have that will help you be an asset and contribute to that graduate program or institution as a postdoc. Hopefully this talk also helped you to eliminate or reduce bad practice, so you can ultimately get that offer by preparing those interview questions, developing questions for you to ask of those you're going to be meeting with, and also following up with those that you meet with. And so here is my contact information if you have additional questions that we may not get to today, or questions as you are preparing for your interview in the spring, or maybe those that might have upcoming interviews before the holiday season. Feel free to reach out to me. And I believe we have several questions in the Q&A, but I thank you for your time in attending this session today. And so I believe, Paige, are you going to be reading the questions. You can also submit them anonymously. So if you don't want your name attached to the question, don't worry, you can submit it anonymously and we'll have those read.
Hi,
So
Dr.
ready?
Watt. Thank you
Yes.
so much. That was filled with so much knowledge, so many gems. And I hope everyone had their pen and paper, because if not, there was something to be missed. That was excellent. Thank you so much. And I know that I personally really benefited from this as I'm now transitioning from PhD to postdoc. So it was excellent timing, and I hope that everyone else in the audience has really benefited as well. From all the questions, I can see that they definitely have. So I'll stop waffling and I'll begin asking the questions that the attendees would like to know. So I'll start with the first one from someone anonymous. And they're just asking, are there any good resources on top of Google Scholar that we could use to find professors' latest research?
Yeah, so sometimes I mentioned PubMed. I'm in the biomedical sciences, and so that's what we tend to use in our area. But if you have, if there are certain common journals for your disciplines, so, you know, in science, so I believe that you can also find many of the neuroscience related publications on PubMed as well, since it tends to be biomedical related research. But also looking at professional society publications, that might be another great resource. Looking at that professor's website to see what was the most recent publication. If it's something from like 2006, that also gives you an idea how recent the publications are and how updated the website may be. Just searching for that faculty member's name also helps you identify collaborators and their recent and current projects that they have. So in addition to, you know, the Google Scholar, also check with your institution's librarian. Many institutions have if you're at a larger institution, they may have a science librarian that can help you look at other resources to be able to search for faculty or certain research topics. If you're at a smaller institution, your general librarian may be able to provide additional resources for you to connect with some of those faculty and identify some of their more recent publications.
Fantastic, thank you. The second question, for the self-introduction, should you mention in-person introduction by comments?
So I want to have you think about your self-introduction of being an opportunity to really highlight or prepare for discussion on your strengths. And so you really want the conversation to steer more towards your who you are. And actually, let me stop sharing. I think I have an example, and I'll pull that up in a minute, of a self-introduction. And I skipped that in my slides as I was preparing. But you really want it to, it's an opportunity for you to kind of steer the conversation and just set it up for what it is that you're wanting to prepare and discuss in that conversation. Because remember, your interviews with people, especially if it's one at a time, might be 15 to 20 minutes. So it's prime information that you really want to share. And I'm going to share my screen again and just give you an example of one where I used an example from my background. Oops, it's not letting me share again. That's interesting. Technology. So
do you have the option available?
Yes, I do. Let's see. Okay, I got it now. All right, hopefully you all can see it, but yeah. I'll read it as well. So I would say, good afternoon, good morning. I'm Danielle Watt. I'm a senior chemistry major at Albany State University, which you may have, may remember from my application. I look forward to graduating this May and joining a PhD program in biochemistry, or in my case, maybe it's bioorganic chemistry, to study cancer development. I'm specifically interested in how mutations in certain genes ultimately cause cancer. So that tells them why I'm moving from the chemistry to biochemistry or bioorganic chemistry without me going into the specifics as to why, because it will prepare me to pursue a career as a research scientist in industry focused on drug development. My previous research experience at the National Cancer Institute, working with Professor X or Dr. X and Y, led me to learn more and wanting to learn more and pursue this particular field. And so from those few sentences, you can pull out a lot of information. And so it's just a brief introduction as to who I am and some of the things I might want to discuss during that interview. And so adding that the personal information as far as hobbies or other things, it could open you up to conversations that will distract from the reasons why you're wanting to give that interview. Or maybe you bring up a topic that someone else is not comfortable in discussing, or they have opposing views. And so that's really going to distract from who you are, what the skills and experiences you're bringing to that interview. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yes, definitely. It was a comprehensive answer, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there. We sometimes don't think about the fact that it might be something that other people aren't comfortable talking about, and I think that was a really good point. Moving on from that, we have how would you answer the why you should be accepted into the program, and what elements would you include in that answer?
Yes, so you really have to do some reflection as to, well, why did you apply to the program? So there isn't like a cookie cutter answer. And I find that some students are like, okay, well, what should I tell them? Well, my question to you is, why did you apply to the program? What interests you about that program? Are there certain faculty that you wanted to work with? Are there certain techniques that you wanted to learn? Beyond just the reputation of the institution or the reputation of that graduate program. If it's just one faculty member whose research really interests you, is that the graduate program for you if that professor isn't going to be accepting students? Are you going to have the opportunity to work with other people who, over the next 5-6 years of your life, you're going to stay engaged with that work, even when you're facing challenges and barriers, or the research isn't going the way you want it? And so really, this is a time for you to self-reflect, because you're going to get those questions, and how you answer and are able to articulate your passions, your interests, that could dictate whether or not you get an offer to that graduate program. So you really want to think about, why am I applying to this program? Why have I applied to this program? How does it relate to my educational goals, my career goals? And how is it going to help me develop further? How is it going to provide me with opportunities to contribute beyond my research experience and my knowledge to the program, and make the environment even better for other graduate students, other researchers, other postdocs?
Great, thank you. Another one from an anonymous attendee. Thank you very much for putting these workshops together. I'm applying to grad school, so this is very helpful. Following the STAR method, should the situation always be in the context of the lab or research experiences, or is it okay to refer to situations outside of the lab?
It's definitely okay to refer to situations outside of the lab. I saw a question earlier. It's like, will she have multiple STAR stories? Yes, you should. I always say to advise people to prepare 5 to 8 STAR stories of your experience or your strengths. And those experiences, you have experiences outside of research, but how does it play on certain strengths that you have? Maybe an example of a leadership role that you've had, maybe experience with your community and engagement work, if you're involved in outreach, or you volunteer your time with community groups or organizations. What skills did you develop that could also translate to your success as a graduate student or a postdoc or an employee? Does it align with some of the missions, goals, visions, or even DEI statements of that organization? although your primary focus is going to be research, how are you going to demonstrate that you have other skills outside of the lab? Maybe your ability to work well with others. But yes, you should have multiple star stories, but also I think about experiences outside of research that can really highlight certain key strengths that you have.
Fantastic, thank you. Our next question is, during an interview, if we express ourselves through our facial expressions, it helps us to engage better rather than showing none. Is this appropriate according to you, or should one be more neutral?
I would say show up as your authentic self. I am someone who have many facial expressions, and some of them, some people, I've had people say like, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "Nothing's wrong. I'm thinking." That's my thinking face, right? Or someone will ask me a question, I'll give them a look, and they say, "No, that's not right." And I said, "No, I'm not saying, I'm processing." So I have a processing face, I have a thinking face, I have an engaged face, and sometimes they can come off and give people different interpretations. And so I try to be mindful of how I'm looking at someone, especially if it's a situation where I'm not too happy. So you have to be mindful of that as well. But I would say show up as who you are, what makes you comfortable, because that's going to, hopefully you won't feel like you have to try to force yourself to fit in a mold that's not you, because that's not going to be helpful for you while you're in graduate school for 5 to 6 years, or even in a postdoc or in a professional job, because you want to be comfortable and supported and encouraged in the space that you're going to be training or working in. And you can't do that if you're not going to be your authentic self. And so if you gauge your expressions, just be mindful of the type of expressions you have. I try, and nervous is really easy for me. I like to smile. So that helps to also relax other people that I'm working with. And so think about, or practice in the mirror and look at yourself like, I didn't even know I made that face, right? And so, and just so the facial expressions, it's one thing that even as much effort you may put into, okay, I'm not going to make this face when I see it's a common face. You have no control how other people interpret it, but just show up as who you are and being comfortable in that space and in your skin.
I love that answer, especially because I am very expressive through my face as well.
Yes. And as people get to know you, they'll learn that about you, right?
Yes.
And so if that turns someone off initially, that's not your problem, that's their problem. And so, yes, I always encourage people to show up authentically as to who you are, because that's going to hopefully reduce the amount of stress that you'll have already engaging in that graduate program or on the job. And you don't want to contribute to having any more stress than needed.
Exactly. Okay, so I think we'll go for one last question and then we'll wrap up. So this one's about changing fields from master's to PhD. And during an interview, is it appropriate to mention that master's research, for example, even though it's not related to the PhD that's being applied for? And is there a way or a best way to handle that?
Yeah, so I would say when you're identifying, especially those research experiences, you want to focus on, hopefully, initially those that are connected to the areas that you want to pursue. But you can also refer back to other areas, especially if it helped you to figure out that this is the discipline or the area I wanted to go into. It's like I initially started in this area because I'm a chemist. My PhD and my bachelor's are in chemistry. But as you heard, I have done DNA replication and repair work, which chemists usually are not in that field. So one question I often received was, well, I said, what made you pursue chemistry versus genetics or molecular biology? And so I have to prepare my response to that question, right? And so, but thinking of being in those fields as a chemist allows me to think of challenges and problems in a different way than molecular biologists or geneticists. But then it also helps me to develop additional skills as a chemist in those areas. And at the time I was going through my PhD training, that's when we started to use interdisciplinary research and training. And so although my degree was in a particular area, the training I received was in other fields. And it was rare at that time that people would move into other disciplines. So you can talk about the specific skills you learned that will translate over into this new discipline or new field, or talk about how being trained in that other field with your master's gives you a different way of problem solving or your approach to thinking more critically. So it just depends on what skills you learned and how you want to frame that. But be prepared for that question.
Fantastic. I'm just going to squeeze in one last question. How should you respond if you're asked about other programs you applied and got interview offers for?
That's a great question. I'll put myself in this too as a recruiter. Academics, we could be very slick. It's like, oh, well, tell us about other programs you applied to, right? Because we want to see where we are in your list, what other programs are offering. And if you ultimately decline our offer, well, what can we do to offer, something that I don't know, Michigan is offering, or Yale or MIT is offering, to get students to really consider our offers. And so there's a polite way that you can do it where you can maybe respond in a way. So that's where I find having these prepared star stories as to being kind of helpful, because you don't have to go through and describe the situation. But thinking like, I've applied to several programs, I have several interviews, but this is what it really motivates me to want to come to University of Connecticut Health Center, right? Or the University of Connecticut Chemistry program. So you can, really focus your response to why you're interested in that program versus responding to all of the other offers you have. And even if you only have one offer, that's none of their business, right? So sometimes that's the way for us to kind of be slick and saying, okay, well, what are other people offering? Where are we on your list? And so, especially if the program is really motivated to recruit you, you might get that, but you can always tailor. It's like, well, yeah, I have several, interviews or offers, but this is what attracts me to your program.
Excellent. I think that is fantastic insight from the other side of the interview process. So thank you so much, Dr. I know that everyone is incredibly appreciative of your time today, and I am excited for next week's session and joining then. In the chat, we will drop our YouTube link and resources for part 2 for those of you. And fantastic. So yes, thank you all for coming out this evening. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed and have written down all of those notes ahead of time. Great. So thank you.